Tell Me More podcast is being recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. This episode contains content that may be distressing to some listeners, including discussions around eating disorders, anxiety, and self-harm. Please take care when listening. If you or someone you know is struggling with any of the topics discussed, please reach out to Lifeline 13 11 14. There are other resources for support in the show notes. Our guest today is a self-proclaimed retired party girl turned relatable therapist. Amanda White is an author and the founder and director of Therapy for Women Centre, a therapy practice based out of Philadelphia. Amanda quit drinking 9 years ago and is passionate about teaching women how to set boundaries and engage in real self-care. In this episode, we talk about sobriety and reassessing your relationship with alcohol. My name is Olivia Molly Rogers, and I'm excited to get comfortable in the uncomfortable with you and remind you that nobody is perfect and everybody has something going on behind the scenes that you may not know about. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Amanda, thank you so much for joining me. I have been a big fan of yours online for years now. I was really excited when I came across your page. I feel like it was maybe 2020 or around then. But I love the work that you do helping women online and through your podcast and your book. I loved reading your book. You have been sober for 7 years now. Can you talk me through what it was that inspired you to change your relationship with alcohol?
Yeah, I've actually been sober for 9 years
Nine,
now, just
wow.
because time is what is time anymore.
Yeah. Wow, 9 years.
Yeah. So it wasn't, how do I say this? I struggled a lot with alcohol throughout college, throughout just like being in high school and things like that. I really had a lot of social anxiety. So for me, alcohol just felt like friends in a bottle. It was this great solution to this problem that I was having. And I felt like a better version of myself. And it worked for a while in that it gave me a false sense of confidence. I felt like, when I was especially in college, it wouldn't have really worked to not drink. But my mental health just really declined throughout college and afterwards. And I also struggled with an eating disorder. And the two of those things together just really didn't mesh very well. And eventually it got to the point where I just felt like I was living a life completely outside of my values. I was going to school to become a therapist, but I was drinking a ton on the weekends, or sometimes quite literally I worked at a rehab at the time, and I would come into work hungover after, and working with other people with addiction issues. And at the time, I did not see how glaringly hypocritical that was.
Yeah.
But I had a moment where I was a yoga teacher at the time, and I had a moment where I went out the night before I taught yoga, and I taught yoga totally drunk, and I didn't remember teaching yoga. And at the time, yoga was like the most important thing in my life. And I just had this moment of being like, oh my gosh, if I keep doing this, I am going to have a problem and I'm never going to become a therapist. And I want to tackle this now before it gets worse later.
Yeah. How did you do that? Like, how did you sort of make that first step?
So thankfully, I was already in a lot of therapy at the time. So I had a therapist who was probably the first person that I told about this idea. She had kind of challenged me earlier to stop drinking for 30 days because I would come into her office and I would say, I did this thing when I was drunk and I feel bad about it, or I drank way too much and I keep trying to cut back, but I haven't been able to. So it essentially started with me I went to AA. I went through a 12-step program. I wasn't sure if I was an alcoholic or not. I wasn't sure if the label fit me or not. I just knew I couldn't keep doing what I was doing. So I was willing to just go to 12-step programs if that worked. And I was lucky that I also had friends who, because I was in recovery from my eating disorder, who I happened to know just people in the recovery community. So I had a friend or two who was already in AA, and they really supported me and kind of walked me through the beginning few months.
That's awesome. When you say that you didn't feel like the alcoholic label fit you, I really liked in your book when you call it disordered drinking. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. So that term came from actually the term disordered eating, because as a therapist, we know that not everyone fits criteria to have an eating disorder, but people can end up in these disordered patterns of behavior where people, right, like maybe binge or purge, or they starve themselves for a period of time. Even dieting, you could say, is disordered. And because of that label, I've found as a therapist, people are much more likely to have a conversation about where maybe their eating is disordered, because I'm not labeling them as anorexic or bulimic or having an eating disorder. And that's the problem. And what's really missing for me with alcohol and drinking is you have to either be an alcoholic or have a substance use disorder or not. And I think that a lot of people fall into this spectrum where they've abused alcohol or had an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. I think most people, if they're honest, can attest that they had an unhealthy relationship with alcohol in college. And that doesn't mean, though, that it will be that way forever if they take precautions and they also, aren't going through trauma, or they don't have other mental health issues or things like that. And I think being able to give someone a space to recognize the patterns are unhealthy, but not stick them with a permanent label, gives people a lot more space to explore it. Because the problem with our current way we talk about alcohol is, if you ask someone, right, or if someone says, I have a problem with drinking, we just assume that they can never drink again. And that's a really big commitment. And it's also very confronting. When I often ask someone about their alcohol use in therapy, the first thing they'll say to me is, well, I'm not an alcoholic. So that totally shuts down the conversation, rather than us being like, I'm not saying you are. I don't know if you are, but what if we just explored how alcohol isn't serving you?
Yeah. I can relate to that. Like, so I took some time off alcohol in 2021. I got to a point where I just was sick of the same feeling every weekend. I was drinking too much on a weekend and then beating myself up about it on the Sunday, and it was affecting my relationship with my ex. We would have these big disagreements when we drank every time. It was like just a matter of what it was going to be about, but it was a pattern. And so at first I was just going to take 30 days off. And in those 30 days, I decided to really like delve into it and confront my issues, which was terrifying. So I read lots of books and I did lots of journaling, and all this stuff came up for me. And I was like, wow, okay, I'm going to keep going after 30 days. And 30 days turned into 100, and then 100 days turned into a year and a half. I know from the get-go, though, when people would sort of talk to me about it, and it took me a little while to actually be telling people that that's what I was doing, because of this shame where I was like, oh, I don't want anyone to think I'm an alcoholic. I'm not an alcoholic. I'm like, I didn't depend on alcohol. I didn't drink every day. I wasn't, I think we have this misconception of like what an alcoholic looks like as well, that it's, a homeless man or, a really aggressive man rather than, your average Joe. But yeah, there was this, like, I felt really defensive about it. And that sort of dissipated. I think the longer I had off alcohol and the more I sort of dealt with my feelings around it, that kind of went away. But I'd love for you to talk to me about the people that you see that come to you who have, disordered drinking, as you call it. What do they typically look like? Because you mentioned that it often coexists with perfectionism, eating disorders. Yeah, can you talk to me about that?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm speaking from a perspective of working with women with substance use, where I think someone who specializes in a different population may say something else. But I think that there is such a connection between all those things you mentioned, we really look at alcohol also in our society, I think, as this idea of what grown-ups do to cope with life. If you look at the media, you look at TV shows, it's like everyone that's having a hard day, you know, like especially women, right? They put their kids to bed and then they're drinking a glass of wine, or someone had a hard day at work and they're pouring a drink when they get home. And it's really shapes how I think we understand cult or how we understand alcohol and its use. And so as a result, I think that if you don't know how to process life or deal with work stress is such a big issue, right? If you don't know how to deal with that without using alcohol, you're going to put yourself in a vulnerable position where, unless you are really good at managing your stress, you are going to need more alcohol. If your life gets more stressful, you're going to need more alcohol to cope with that stress. And that is where we can get into some of those unhealthy relationships, or things happen to us that are beyond our control, like having a child is stressful, losing your job is stressful, ending a relationship is stressful. And if we're already in the habit of relying on alcohol for just our everyday stress, and then a big stressor comes into our life, it's going to put us in a place where we can pretty easily end up in an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. So those are a lot of things I see. I think for women especially, there's so much pressure on women to look a certain way, to feel a certain way. You know, even the connection a lot of times with drinking and perfectionism, it's a way to cope with wanting to be perfect, or it's a way to cope with feeling like we have to look a certain way a lot of times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a lot that I related to reading your book, because I read your book more recently.
Yeah.
And I do drink again now.
Yeah.
But the old me, the pre, sober curiosity me, like I felt like you were writing about me, and like in so many of the ways that you described, I had an eating disorder, and you were talking about, on a night out when you're sort of figuring out how many calories you can have, so you skip a meal so that then you can go and drink. And then I would just get way too drunk because I hadn't eaten. And then that was sort of the problem. Both problems were exacerbating each other. You speak about how you had an eating disorder as well. Can you talk me through your experience with the two at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's hard about it, or any other issue we deal with, is often it kind of is the seesaw, where, at least what I see in my work and my experience, when I was better with my eating disorder, I would drink more. When I was drinking more, when I was drinking less, my eating disorder was worse. And it often can kind of go up and down in that way of, to cope with not drinking, we may end up leaning into using food as a coping skill, or dieting as a coping skill. That was definitely the case for me. I also started dabbling in prescription drugs because I did a lot of what you were saying too, is I would skip meals. I was bulimic. So when I would get drunk, a lot of times I would binge and purge, and I would like lose total control of that, essentially. And I really didn't want to stop drinking when I did. But the biggest reason I did, not just was what I was saying about I was kind of being a hypocrite, but it was also because I was really committed to being in recovery from my eating disorder. And when I would drink, it was really hard for me to stay in recovery from that, essentially, because I would lose control, essentially.
Yeah. I want to know more about the perfectionism thing as well, because it almost seems ironic that there's these women who want to be this perfect woman, but then they'll go out and get absolutely blind drunk. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, I think when you have this extremely rigid idea for yourself that you need to be perfect, there is only so much pressure a person can take for so long before we need an outlet, or we need a place to escape that a bit. And often with alcohol, it becomes this very socially acceptable way to let loose and escape from those very rigid standards we have of ourselves, or we feel like society puts on us. And I think it's interesting because there's this notion with alcohol that, maybe we weren't really ourselves, or we weren't totally conscious of the things we were doing or saying. It becomes this helpful outlet where people don't maybe even hold you responsible or accountable for the things you do when you're drinking. And it becomes a really good outlet for people who have so much pressure on themselves. It is just impossible it's impossible to be perfect. So instead, to cope with that, it's very common to drink. So then we have this little outlet where we don't have to be perfect.
Yeah, I can relate to that as well, for sure.
Yeah.
I think would put so much pressure on myself. The time that I think my drinking was my way to blow off steam the most was when I was at uni, and my eating disorder was at its peak, and I put so much pressure on myself to get really good grades, and every time I went out, I'd just write myself off. But then, like you said, people sort of say, oh, it's fine because you're at uni, it's what we do, like that's what everyone was doing. So I didn't ever question it too much. Like I'd beat myself up on a Sunday a bit, but then I'm like, oh, it's fine. I'll forget about it. But then it wasn't until I took that time off alcohol later that I think all this stuff came up. Like I think when you're doing that and you're binge drinking and you're not dealing with the underlying issues, that you sort of squash everything. And in the books that I was reading, they all talk about this, phenomenon where like everything that you've squashed, once you stop drinking, like all of the other feelings come up. Did that happen for you?
Oh, yes, for sure. For sure. And I mean, I have yet to meet really anyone. If you have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, or you're engaging in some like disordered drinking, I think it's extremely uncommon to not have stuff come up, because, right, alcohol does temporarily do a really good job of shutting down anxiety and stress, because what it does is it turns off that front part of our brain, which is our inner critic. It's our inner thoughts. It's the part of us that are surveying us. So when we were talking about perfectionism, right, it's the part of us that's like, you don't stand up straighter, suck in your stomach. Why did you say that? You sound so stupid, right? Like all those judgments. That's what alcohol does an amazing job of doing. You're a lot less aware of yourself, essentially. So that's where we get the escape. And it's also what you were talking about of, if we are just shutting down that critical part of ourselves, or that even anxious part of ourselves or emotional part of ourselves, when we stop drinking, we are going to be left with facing it, because alcohol is just this temporary numbing that happens. It doesn't actually make us more confident, teach us that our worth is not how we look, right? Like teach us coping skills. It's just numbing everything. So when we stop engaging in the numbing, we have to deal with what we've been, not just what we're dealing with, but what we've been repressing and holding on to throughout the whole time.
Yeah. You talk a lot about self-soothing, and the fact that most of us haven't really been taught how to self-soothe.
Yeah.
I found that really interesting, because it's not something I've really thought about before. And I think that's something that in my time off alcohol I was able to do, is to sort of teach myself subconsciously, because until I read your book, I was like, oh, I didn't know I was doing that. But I think that's what I was doing, like through therapy and through facing those emotions and journaling, is like finding other ways to, self-soothe. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. I think it's funny with self-soothing, because I think we think of it as, we talk about it in terms of like babies, right? Or like children, like teaching them how to soothe and go back to sleep and things like that. But we need to be able to learn how to do that as adults, because life is stressful. We're going to always have different things going on. We can't control necessarily what someone says to us always, or what will happen in our life. And we need to be able to learn how to really take care of ourselves when life is difficult, or not going our way, or even just dealing with the daily stress of being a person. Being in the world, we as we discover, we interact with different stressors and triggers and things like that, it has a physical toll on us. And if we don't learn ways to soothe at the end of the day, to cope, whether that's through some of the things you were talking about or, going for a walk, reconnecting with nature, doing something to get into your body a lot of times can be really, really helpful. We aren't going to be able to stay sober because we're using alcohol as a way to soothe ourselves.
Yeah. You also spoke about the NAILA.
Yeah.
This acronym that you came up with it. Is that right?
I did. Yeah.
Can you explain that? Because I loved that.
Yeah. So one of the things, as a therapist, but also online, people, love to say you need to learn how to process your emotions. But a lot of people are like, what the heck does that mean? Like processing is such a abstract idea. It's hard to know whether if you're feeling your emotions, are you processing them? So I came up with this acronym of exactly step by step how to do it. And it's NAILER, so the first step is noticing. It is noticing because all emotions start as physiological sensations in your body. So if you, start having your heart rate increase or your throat feel like it's closing up or your stomach feels queasy or your hands get hot, that is typically a body sensation that's connected to an emotion that's happening. So the first step is to notice. The second step is to allow, because often when we start to feel that discomfort, that body sensation, we don't want to feel it. We want to either distract ourselves or numb ourselves, or just kind of zone out, try to get away from that feeling. But it's actually really important to allow it to come up. It doesn't need to be something that you do right then and there. Like if you are in a meeting, you may not, if you feel like, nervous in a meeting, you may not be able to stop the meeting and process your emotions right there. So I want to make note of that because that's why the step is allow. Like we do have some control over whether we allow ourselves to experience the emotion or not. So you want to, specifically allow it to come up. Then you want to investigate it. And this really just means like being curious about why might this emotion be coming up? What am I feeling? What was I doing right before this? Because emotions are developed in context. And what I mean by that is if your stomach started to feel queasy and you're about to do a presentation at work, it's probably pretty clearly that those two things are connected. Where if you were in a car reading and your stomach felt queasy, it may actually be that you're like car sick.
Yeah.
And that may be what's going on. So physiological sensations make sense in the context. And that's what you want to notice. How was I feeling right before this? Did I just, talk to my mom or did someone cut me off in traffic? Like what are the stressors that happened preceding this physiological body sensation? From there, you want to label. So you want to try to label the emotion as accurately as possible. And we know from research that actually the more accurately you can label your emotion, the better you're going to be able to regulate your emotion. If you think about kids and how they often only have a few words to regulate their emotions, if a child only knows the word happy, sad, and mad, they're going to feel happy, sad, or mad 1/3 of their life. Where if they start to learn the differences and they learn the word frustrated, then they'll feel mad a little less and it'll help them regulate a bit more. And then the final step or two, I kind of combine them, are explore and release. So once I'm feeling anxiety from this presentation, I know that it's anxiety because of how it feels in my body. You want to let that emotion move through you in some way and explore it. So it may be you want to talk to a therapist about it. Maybe you journal. Maybe you call a friend. Maybe you go for a walk and you listen to some music that will help you move the emotion through you. Emotions do have a start and an end point in terms of physiological body sensations. But the biggest reason that people think they're processing their emotions, but they're not, is often what happens is when people feel a physiological body sensation come up, they judge it. They say, why am I feeling this way? What's wrong with me? Oh my God, this again. I can't believe I'm nervous about this presentation. I prepared so much. And you spin into judgment, which is not actually getting to the root of your emotion and processing it.
Yeah. Oh, I just think it's so clever, and I wish that it's something that we all grew up learning about. I think so many of us are so bad at processing our emotions, which is why people turn to things like alcohol.
Totally.
With the women that you see, what do you think are the most common issues that have led them to a point where they're struggling with alcohol?
I would say it's a good point, or that's a good question. I have a couple different ways I could take it. I mean, I would just say, I think recently, I think that the world is a lot. I think there's a lot going on in the world. I think that we are under more stress than ever. We're extremely connected on social media. So we're not just connected to what's going on with people in our lives, but also the world. And we have the ability, and I wonder if you relate to this too, Olivia, is right, like being a person online, I think even if you don't have a platform or anything, you're going to be exposed much more than ever to people telling you lots of things to do. Even if it's just like you're a new parent and you're scrolling online and you see, 5 things you should never do as a parent. There's so much advice. There's so much do this, not do that. It conflicts. There's so many opinions that I think it's really, really overwhelming, and it can make us feel like we are constantly not good enough, whether it's at work, whether it's at home, all of these things. And I think that is a huge reason that is overlooked sometimes of why a lot of my clients drink, is they feel like they're not good enough at their job, their friend groups don't look like other people's friend groups online, or they're not making enough money for the goals that they had set out because they want to have a certain thing, or they're dealing with their family being disappointed with them. It's a lot of stress of other people's opinions and feeling not good enough.
Yeah, that makes sense. But then it's interesting because I think when you drink too much, then you worry more about what people think as well. It's a bit of a vicious cycle.
Totally, it's a trap.
I found it really interesting the time when I stopped drinking, when I would tell people, whether that be online or in person, that people would get triggered. Like they would instantly then tell me about their relationship with alcohol. I was like, I wasn't actually questioning you. I wasn't like, I'm not judging you. And it has nothing to do with you. This is what I'm doing. Why do you think that is?
Totally. Oh my gosh, I relate to that so much. It's wild what people, I think, will say and do. I think it is because, unlike other things, we have this narrative still in society that if you stop drinking, that like the only people who should stop drinking are people who have a problem with drinking. Like that's very different than other things. Because, right, like alcohol is this thing that everyone should do baseline. It shows that you're fun. The only acceptable reasons to not drink are that you have a problem. So if you're not drinking, people assume that you have a problem. And then often they think that if you have a problem and they drank like you or drank somewhat like you, that you think that they have a problem. So they will pretty quickly become defensive, because they make that up, I think, in their heads. Or they also think that, I think there's this idea that people who don't drink are very judgmental and they're no fun, right? Because alcohol means fun and letting loose and not taking yourself too seriously. So if you don't drink and you don't have a problem, you're no fun for sure. Yeah. So those are the only 2 reasons. So they either think that, you think they're an alcoholic, or you're no fun, so you're judging them.
Yeah. No, I felt that so much, that people just assumed that I would be judging them, that I would be boring, that I would always leave early. And when I actually didn't do any of those things, like I ended up having my hens for my wedding. I was sober. My wedding day, I was sober. My 30th birthday, there were multiple nights where I would stay out till 3 a.m. without a drop of alcohol. And I had a great time. And then I could wake up in the morning and feel really good about myself as well. My friends hated talking to me the next day though, because I'd be like, oh, remember when this happened? Because I would remember everything, obviously. And they're like, stop. Like, we don't need to hear it back. But that was really surprising and interesting to see people's reactions when they would say, oh, you're actually fun not drinking. Because it is such a misconception that alcohol makes you more fun.
Totally.
Do you still, party? You say that you're a retired party girl. Do you still go out though without drinking?
Yeah, I mean, I relate to what you were saying a lot of I had a sober bachelorette, I had a sober wedding. I mean, people drank at my wedding, to be clear, and at the bachelorette. But yeah, I think I am so much more fun without drinking because I used to spend so much time. I mean, I was not fun to be around when I drank at the end because I would abandon people. I would say mean things. I would just do things that were out of character and then feel terrible the next day and have to go on kind of like an apology tour. Or I'd be so hungover on vacation that I wouldn't want to do anything. I'm a new parent now, so I feel like I don't know. I'm still figuring out what I am.
Yeah.
In terms of what going out looks like for me and everything like that. But yes, there was a long time before I had her that I felt like I had so much more fun going out. I love going to weddings and dancing and being sober. I think that it is such a myth, like that you can't have fun. I was so much. There is such a confidence, I think, of actually being able to go to an event sober. Like you watch people in line desperately being like, I'm too sober to be here. I need to drink right now. I need to, and they're like vibrating in line to get a drink. And there's such power in being able to go to something alone, being able to have fun and not drink and even like drive yourself home if you want to. Yeah. I just feel like the interesting thing is people don't want to do it because they feel scared maybe and feel like I could never go out to a bar or whatever, not drinking. But you also have never probably learned how to do that. And I'm a big believer that it's also a skill that you can practice.
Yeah, I found it really interesting in the book you were talking about the fact that a lot of us start drinking too young, underage, which I did. So then when you start going to social events, you're always drinking. So you literally don't learn how to interact with strangers in that setting without alcohol. So it's when you stop, like I that was a skill that I had to learn, but it was really empowering. It's like every time you do, go to a different event where you have never been without at least like a glass of champagne or something before, it's nerve-wracking, but you sort of pass that point, and then I found that every time I was feeling more and more confident. And I now, like, even though I do have a drink, I can go to anything sober and not feel like I've got to rush to the bar to get a drink to feel comfortable to talk to anyone. Like I am the most confident I've ever been, and I think that's from having that time off. Totally. I think that what you said about people thinking that you should only stop drinking if you have a problem, I would love for you to talk more about that, because I think, I've been judged a lot because I took time off and then now I drink again. And it's something that people ask me about all the time. But it's because I did so much work on myself that time, where I just feel like my relationship with alcohol completely changed, where I can take it or leave it. I'm not drinking to get drunk. I'm not drinking because other people are drinking and I feel like I have to. It's like I can have a few drinks, have a really good time, call it quits when I want to, and not feel like a bad person the next day. I would love to hear your thoughts on that though. Like, what do you think about people taking
Yeah.
time off and going back?
I think it's actually great. I think it's really cool what you've talked about because the way that you just talked about your relationship with alcohol to me really shows, obviously, I don't, obviously I don't know, I can't promise anything, but it sounds to me like you've really done a lot of work on it. And what I really love also about what you've done is you learned the skills. Like I think that so often when people want to take a break, they want to take a break for a short period of time and they want to take a break for a time and then they want to kind of like hold themselves off so
Mm.
that they don't have to expose themselves to going to a wedding sober or doing all of these things. So then they end the time off or the break and they often just boomerang right back because they didn't learn the skills of how to go to a bar sober, how to process your emotions, how to soothe. I try not to give people prescriptions of how long they need to take off if they want to change their relationship with alcohol. But I think a year is a really great period of time because you go through all of the seasons.
Mm.
You go through summer and having to deal with that. You go through spring, you go through the holiday season, and you kind of have memories of being sober through a whole year that you can kind of pull from and yeah, you'll probably have to learn how to do a variety of different things and get through different seasons and regulate your emotions. So, while I don't recommend it for everyone, and I think for some people, depending on, I think of alcohol issues as this progression. So I think that given enough stress and trauma in our lives, we could all end up with an issue with alcohol, and some people are farther along in that progression than other people. So I think that not everyone is it possible for them to take a year off and then moderate. It's not possible for everyone. And for me specifically, because it felt so intertwined with my eating disorder and because it really became a part of my identity and something that I really liked about myself, it was never something that I questioned because it wasn't worth the risk for me.
Mm.
But I think everyone gets to decide that. And I think it really drives me crazy in the sober community when we are so black and white about it. When it's like, if anyone ever does a dry January, they should never drink again. Because everyone has different ideas of what's worth it to them and what isn't worth it to them. And I think we can't be naive and say that there are no benefits to drinking alcohol. Like there are some in at the very least, right? It is something that makes you feel connected to someone in like a celebratory kind of moment.
Mm.
The question I think everyone needs to ask themselves is like, in terms of if they were going back to it or something, is it worth it? And that's where I think experimentation and figuring it out for yourself is really valuable.
Yeah. I like what you said about, actually taking time to learn about it when you're having time off alcohol. I think when people set out to do like, dry July or whatever it is, they just avoid social situations. They're like, oh no, I can't come because I'm not drinking. And so instead they spend more nights at home. They might go to the movies, they might go out to dinner, but have an early night. So they're not actually challenging themselves to be in social settings where they're not drinking. So they're just counting down the days until they drink again. And really nothing's shifted. And I see people doing that all the time. And people often say to me when I say, oh yeah, I had 18 months off alcohol, they're like, oh, I've done 30 days before. And I'm like, oh, cool. Like that's good. And, but the way that they tell me that is like, again, I think it's like this defensive thing where I think when you're talking about alcohol, you're holding up a mirror to them and suddenly they're looking at themselves and they're like, oh shit, maybe I have a problem, but I'm going to convince you that I don't because I've had 30 days off and it was fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. What would be your advice to someone who is thinking that maybe they should take a break for, 30 days, 100 days?
Yeah. I think the best thing you can do is because it really to me isn't always about like time matters, but I also think that it's doing things like you said. Like I had a number of clients who I worked with who got sober during the pandemic and they had like 6 months, maybe even a year not drinking alcohol, but they weren't going out and doing things because of lockdowns. So they still had a lot of work to do when, afterwards, when they had to learn, how do I go to a sober wedding? How do I do this? How do I do that? How do I go on a date? So while it's not bad to do just like a 30 days and take time off, I don't think it is, if you are just counting down the days and if you're not looking at this like an experiment that you can learn from, there is not a ton you're getting out of it besides the health benefits. And if you're just doing it because you're like, I want to reset my tolerance, or I feel not great and I want to sleep better, that's fine. But in terms of changing your relationship with alcohol, there's a lot of inquiry and deep work that needs to be done for you to actually learn about yourself. And if you're just trying to grin and bear through it, and it's kind of like the difference between being on a diet or like changing your relationship, like having a lifestyle change. Like a lot of people can grin and bear and use willpower for a short period of time, but they're not going to learn from that experience.
I think you mentioned Annie Grace in your book. She was it was Annie Grace's program that I found, like a 30-day challenge or 30-day break from alcohol. When I decided that day that I was going to take some time off, I was, Googling everything, and it's amazing what comes up once you start looking. And one of the things that she suggested was, if you get to the end of whatever time you've taken off alcohol, to remove yourself from any fun situation. So like a party or, dinner with friends or something, and drink and record yourself after each drink. And I found like this was so interesting. I didn't do this because I didn't feel like I needed to, but just that realization that I think everybody thinks I am way more fun when I drink, but usually it's the setting that is fun, which is why I think when you learn to have fun sober, you can see that, because you're like, oh no, I'm having a good time because I'm around good people, or I'm at a great venue, or it's really good weather, or I'm on a holiday, and alcohol is just there as well. Whereas I think everyone thinks, no, I have so much fun when I drink, but you just sort of have to pull it back and really analyze that. I would love to hear.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I would love to hear your. No, you're fine. I would love to hear your thoughts on that, and how can we get people to have more fun in social situations without depending on alcohol for that?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big believer in structuring. I mean, especially because I'm sober, I'm a very big believer in structuring situations and events and social gatherings that do not revolve around alcohol. So there could be alcohol served, but I'm a really big believer in trying to have an activity or something else to do, or maybe the activity is really conversation and being in great conversation with people. But thinking about that versus, and having some sort of plan of what we'll do, or even when I'm thinking about going out to a restaurant or a bar or something like that, I really like to find things that have other things to do. Like even if it's, a pool table or foosball or going ice skating or going doing some sort of activity, even if you're just like walking or something like that. I think that, especially too, if you think about the things that were really fun when we were younger, like as kids, we never put a bunch of kids together for a birthday party and we're just like, okay, do what you will, like there was some sort of theme or structured activity. And that's how it's also, if someone feels socially anxious, it gives them something else to focus on. It creates some structure to the event. So obviously we can't always control this if we're going to different events, but I think if you have control over the events you're going to, or you have a control over, if you're in a group of friends who just consistently falls into just hanging out and just drinking, thinking about other things you can do. Even, I mean, there's, as I'm sure you know, there's some amazing mocktails out there. And even like having some sort of mocktail tasting with friends, or cooking together, doing something else that doesn't just revolve around alcohol.
Yeah, I found board games were a good one. Like if I had friends over,
Yeah.
and the whole time that I was not drinking, everyone around me was still drinking, which I actually liked, because I feel like there's this fear that people think because you're not drinking, they're going to be forced into that as well, and they become self-conscious. But it wasn't about them, it was about me. So I feel like it's good when people keep doing what they're going to do anyway. But yeah, I like what you said about setting an activity. I think having a start and an end is really good. Like having a way that you can exit if you want to. When people around you are drunk and they start repeating the same stories over and over, you're like, I've heard this one. It sounds exactly the same the third time, a little more slurry. If you could get someone who's listening to this, you know, this might encourage them to take a little break off alcohol or sort of reassess. You had a lot of great lists in your book, which I really liked. Mm-hmm. What do you think are maybe 5 reasons why someone should reassess their relationship with alcohol, or like 5 signs? So I'm really putting you on the spot.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I can probably answer both actually. Okay. I think there's a couple signs. I think to me, one of the biggest signs is that you are not like alcohol doesn't feel like it's having the same impact on you as earlier. Like you feel like you have to drink more, you feel like you have to drink differently, you feel like you're not as fun, or you're not enjoying drinking in the same way. I think that's a really good big sign that you would benefit from exploring your relationship with alcohol. Because to me, if that's starting to happen, it's likely to continue to happen and potentially get worse. So it's a good time now to just take a pause and take inventory of it. I think some other signs are if it's impacting any major area of your life, like friendship, relationships, family, work, health, it's a good idea to take a break. If you feel like your anxiety is getting worse, alcohol very much exacerbates anxiety and depression. So it's really hard, I think, especially when I'm working with clients, not to talk about their relationship with alcohol, because alcohol does impact that, not just in terms of like we were talking about with emotional regulation, but it can even impact certain medications people are on and things like that. Yeah, I think those are some of the big signs.
They're really good. Thank you.
Yeah. But different than I think you're blacking out all that, right? Like, I mean, those signs obviously always exist, but I think some of these more subtle, nuanced signs are more important, because the reason I really wrote the book, the reason I talk about things in this way is we know the extreme signs, like you were talking about with like the homeless person who's lost everything. But we don't often talk about some of these, like the majority of the population doesn't drink like that. And yet still people have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. And how can we not leave those people out was kind of my idea when I got into this work and when I wrote my book.
Yeah. And getting people to think about that, because I think we are so quick to be like, oh, well, I am not that bad because I'm not doing those big extreme things. But you can still feel like your relationship with alcohol is not great with those more subtle signs that you mentioned.
Yeah, to me it's not always like, we always ask, is your alcohol use bad enough that you have to stop?
Yeah.
And I actually think the better question is alcohol good enough to keep doing? Like, is it positively impacting your life enough to continue?
Yeah, that's a really good one. I like that. Now,
yeah. And if not, then maybe there's something, you know, you want to look at, because I think that alcohol in the best way, like you were saying, should just enhance things versus being this crutch that we use to cope with life.
Definitely. If you could go back to Amanda quitting drinking, or, you know, before you became a therapist, and you could give her some advice, what would that advice be?
Oh man, that Amanda was Amanda was really struggling. I think the biggest thing I would just say is I truly thought if I stopped drinking, my life would be over. I thought it was like social suicide. I thought that when I stopped drinking and I told my parents were like, no, please don't stop drinking.
Really?
You are going to ruin your life.
Wow.
And that's like not uncommon. A lot of people, I think, have that experience. Maybe it's not their families, but it's their partner, their spouse, their friends, whoever. And my life has gotten so much richer and bigger and better and expanded so much. And I think people think of, oh my gosh, you're going to stop drinking. You're going to limit yourself. There's going to be all these things you can't do. And I can do whatever I want. I just don't drink. And I can, in fact, do things that probably made me too nervous to do before, but I have way more confidence in myself now. Like the only thing I can't really do is like wine tasting or doing some sort of tasting thing. But beyond that, I can do everything. It's not limiting me at all.
That's awesome. I love that. Now I have a segment called Oranges and Lemons, where your lemon is something that's happened today, or it might have been over your weekend that wasn't so positive, and then your orange is something positive. So can you hit me with your orange and lemon? It can be very small or it can be big.
Which one is it again?
So lemon's bad.
Is lemon sour bad?
Lemon sour bad. Okay. Orange is positive.
Okay. The lemon of my weekend would be that my daughter has just been really fussy and struggling, and I struggle a lot to like regulate my emotions when she's crying a lot. Work in progress. And my orange is I went out to dinner with my husband and two of our friends on Friday, and we had a really great night.
I love that. I think my lemon was probably the fact that we had some technical difficulties. It wasn't ideal. It took us a while to get this sorted. But then my orange is the fact that you are on the other side of the world and we've been able to make this conversation happen because I admire you so much and I love the work that you do. So I'm so grateful that we were able to make this work. So thank you.
Absolutely. It was so great to chat with you, Olivia.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure. I would love for you to tell my listeners where they can find you.
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram or online. My handle is Therapy for Women. And you can find my book on Amazon. It's called Not Drinking Tonight. There's also a workbook version that, goes through a lot of the stuff we were talking about. And my podcast is called Recovered-ish, which is available everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Amazing. Thank you so, so much. I've loved chatting to you. And
thank you.
I might need to get you on again, I think. I feel like we could do some questions from the listeners. I think they will probably be quite interested to hear more from you. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, say the word. I am happy to chat with you again, Olivia. This was so great.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Tell Me More. This show wouldn't be possible without you. If you'd like to show your support, please subscribe or follow the podcast on your favorite platforms. And don't forget, you can watch full episodes on YouTube and Spotify.